there you are. Sorry about that. Got distracted. So now what we're going to do is we're going to investigate some of the major classes of the phylum Chordata that fall under the category of vertebrates. That is, that have some sort of a protection vertebra that surround that central nervous cord. We, again, as I've mentioned, we do have a lab that discusses this, so I'm just going to give this brief overview as such. So here's the overall organization of the evolutionary relationships amongst the different chordates. You see from the the deuterostomes. Wow, the deuterostomes. The Echinodermata, of course, is not a chordate, but starting with Cephalochordata, and you see the different features that have evolved that typifies each of these groupings. We have chordates, craniates, vertebrates, gnathosomes, osteichthyons, lobe fins, tetrapods, and amniotes. And you see there, this is a really important graphic for you to view and to get to know when we're talking about the characteristics of each of these different classes of the phylum Chordata. And again, we're just going to briefly go through each of these. So if you have, and we're going to kind of start like really, really basic and then move our way up here. And as each, we're going to include more features as we go. So if you don't have jaws, it's really, these are some really funky looking vertebrates here. The Myxini or the Hag Fishes, and then the Petromyzontidas, the Lampreys. These are two classes where we don't have jaws, and you see there, I mean, there is somewhat a degree of cephalization, but you don't have a jaw. Like the lamprey on the bottom, that they just kind of attach to their parasitic. They attach to, like, you see the lampreys on the sharks, and they just kind of hold on and kind of suck on them and give them like a big hickey here. Hag fishes have cartilage skulls, limited vertebrae. So this is kind of interesting because they don't have a vertebral column all the way down, but there are a few there, right? So they put them in here as far as being vertebrates, kind of like vertebrae light. These are best known for when they get agitated, they secrete a really heavy slime, like really gross slime that covers them. And if you catch a bunch of them in a net, it's just this pool of this snotty stuff. And the lampreys, also we're kind of talking vertebrae-like. They have cartilage that surrounds that notochord, and they have a cartilage skeleton. So they are still considered, even though very kind of in a primitive way, they're still considered those chordates, I should say. So the top there is a hagfish that doesn't have all the mucus around it, the slime, and then the bottom there's a lamprey. I wanted to choose a picture that showed its kind of sucker mouth. But yes, often you see them attached to sharks. Then you wind up with jaws. We call these gnathosome. So these are vertebrates that have jaws. These are chondrichthyes. Chondrichthyes, the class chondrichthyes are your sharks and your rays, where they have skeletons, they have vertebrae, but it's cartilaginous skeleton. It's not a bone skeleton. Whereas the bony fishes, the osteichthyons, these have jaws. You have class Actinopterygii and the class Dipnoi. You have the ray fin fishes. Oh, I spelled that wrong, or a typo, the lobe fin fishes. So, whereas you didn't have jaws, you had vertebrates that didn't have jaws, like the lampreys and the hagfish. In come the jaws. So you have chondrichthyes and Actinopterygii and the Dipnoids, but what separates these two classes is that the presence of, or the absence of, a bony skeleton in your chondrichthyes. They just have cartilage, and then you wind up having these vertebrates with jaws that have the bones. Your bony fishes, and then your ray finned or I'm sorry, your ray fin fishes, and then your lobed fin fishes. Which I should say that most fish that you know of when you go fishing, you know, trout and bass, those are your bony, your ray fin fishes versus your lobed fin fishes. You have class Amphibia. Now what we're working on is now you have naposomes with limbs, right? You're tetrapods. So you've got the jaw, you've got the bones, you've got now limbs. Class Amphibia is one of those. You have salamanders, frogs, toads, and salamanders, caecilians. I'm sorry, your Eurodelias, your salamanders. Tailed ones, that's what that translates to as far as Eurodella for salamanders, your anoras, your tailless ones, your frogs, and your toads. And you have caecilians, which kind of look like worm snakes, but they're not snakes and they're not worms. They're caecilians, and those are your apodas. Now what we're adding to the mix, so you've got the jaws and the bones and you've got the legs, but now you have amniotes. So with your amphibians, you do have reproduction. You have an egg that fertilizes a sperm, and you have eggs that are laid, but the eggs need to be laid in either very moist conditions and mostly water. And the eggs aren't protected. So you also have these animals that they have to maintain like moist or wet skin. Now toads are different. They can live in terrestrial areas, but they still need most of them need some kind of moisture. Whereas most of them have kind of moist or wet skin, and you either need to maintain in the water or at least be moist or wet to allow for oxygen exchange. But the disadvantage, I suppose, is that these eggs have to be laid in the water or a place that's really, 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 really moist, in contact with like really wet soil at all times. Now I'll get to the next one. Your amniotes, what now happens with amniotes is now these animals are able to lay eggs that have some sort of a shell to them that protects them from desiccation, and therefore do not need to be laid in the water. You have class Reptilia. That typifies them is you have scales that have keratin, internal fertilization, shelled egg deposited terrestrially. There's crocodilians, there's turtles, there's lepidosaurs, and yes, there are birds. I fought this. I was going to die on this hill. No, it used to be class Aves, A-V-E-S, class Reptilia and class Aves. But with DNA analysis, birds are in the class of Reptilia because they have so many features that are similar to reptiles, and even like from a DNA standpoint, but like when you say, well, they don't have scales, but they have feathers, which are now believed to be modified scales that are for flight. Now, the difference between birds and the other types of reptiles is that they are endothermic instead of ectothermic. So that was one of the sticking points, I know. Not just the feathers, but the fact that they're endothermic, which people still fought them being classified with reptiles, but here we are. And they are, and I'm just going to have to get over it, and I'm just going to have to accept it. But that's a great advantage. You don't need to be in the water anymore to lay eggs. You can pretty much lay eggs anywhere for reproduction. You're not intimately tied to the water for most of these for any reason. And then what you're going to do is you wind up having mammals. These are amniotes that have hair and milk. So what typifies these is they have some kind of fur, some kind of covering of hair, and there are some that lay eggs, so we can't say they all give live birth. That's kind of an outlier, but we have the mammals. So produce milk and nurse their offspring. You have monotremes, which are platypus and echidna, that actually lay eggs, but they do produce milk for their offspring. Marsupials are classified in the way that there is they don't lay eggs, but the embryos exit the womb at an extremely underdeveloped state. And then they have to crawl into some sort of a pouch that's on the front lower part of the mother, where they then latch onto a teat or a nipple and receive nutrients that way, and they continue their development externally in some sort of a pouch. Opossums, kangaroos, koalas are marsupials. And then the rest, most mammals, are eutherians, placental mammals, where the offspring develops in a placenta inside the womb internally of the mammal, and then when is able to survive outside of the mother, is then birthed. And, well, people, of course, but all sorts of mammals. Other mammals as well that you can think of, most of these are considered eutherians. So that is just a very brief overview of vertebrates. We're going to cover this more extensively in lab, but just to give you an overview on what that is about. All right, we'll see you later. Bye, everybody.